thrilled to be I'm really thrilled to be with you this lunchtime to share a little bit about my research. I was saying to Jem before we started, this is still really a work in progress. I'm in the midst of the work at CHS and also a bunch of other archives around New England. So you'll really hear me talking about what I've done so far and some of the areas that I still need to flesh out. So I'm looking forward to sharing this with you. So I'm going to go ahead and start my screen share. And can everyone see this? Yeah, okay, I see Jen's nodding. All right then, so I'll get going then. Let me just minimize this video so I don't see me. All right then, so in July of 1732, Captain Crowe loaded up his sloop and set sail out of the New England colony of Rhode Island and headed to St. Christopher in the West Indies. Crowe's cargo was primarily livestock with 16 horses, all of which traveled on deck. Crowe and his horses, though, never made it to St. Christopher. After a month at sea off of Bermuda, they were hit with a gale that capsized the sloop and quickly cleared the deck of its equine cargo. Crowe and his crew clung to the sloop and were almost up to their middle in water for 36 hours before cutting away the mast which righted the vessel. They continued for 19 days like this and were hit again by hard gales. They were, and I quote, in the hazard of perishing when they met with divine providence when fellow New England trader Captain Jonathan Remington, who was bound for Antigua, picked them up and delivered them to safety. So Crewe's sloop then was one of the many New England ships that braved the dangerous aquatic highway that was the 18th century Atlantic in a quest for delivering horses to the sugar colonies in the West Indies. From the late 17th century through to the American Revolution, New England, particularly the colonies of Rhode Island and Connecticut, dominated this trade and even developed their own breed, which was much sought after, the Narragansett Pacer. However, by the middle of the 19th century, New England's equine trade had waned and the Narragansett Pacer was on its way to extinction. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit today about why Rhode Island and Connecticut specifically emerged as breeding ground for horses and how they came to dominate the trade to the sugar colonies. And I'm going to try to share with you as many as I can of the different primary source documents that I've been using to try to piece this project together as part of my research for the New England Regional Fellowship Consortium Award that I'm really lucky to have got. So let's start in the 17th century before we move into the 18th. And so Francis Higginson first brought 13 horses to Massachusetts in 1629, and 60 more arrived with John Winthrop's fleet the following year. Horses were not used for draft work primarily in New England due to the rough ground. Therefore, New Englanders bred distinct types of horses for specific jobs. Firstly, they raised draft horses solely for exportation to the sugar colonies to crush the cane in the mill. And secondly, they bred saddle horses for domestic travel and exportation. And if I zoom in on the image you just saw, you can actually see these two types of horses. So this horse that the enslaving plantation master is sat on here, this is clearly a fine riding horse. We can tell it's a Narragansett Pacer by the color and the way it stood. And this one too, that the enslaved person is handling here, are riding horses. But this horse here, this kind of light dun horse, that's heavier set, it's got thicker feathers, it's big of a crest. That would be one of the draft horses that was getting ready to be exported. The most notable type of saddle horse then was the Narragansett Pacer, which you see here from an undated image that's housed at South County History Center. And as Jen said, the Narragansett Pacer is another piece of research that I've done, and I'd be more than happy to talk about Narragansett Pacers in the Q&A if you're interested. So from the mid-17th century onwards then, New Englanders knew that there was money to be made in exporting horses. And I've got a couple of 17th century quotes to share with you. So John Hull laid out the potential breeding program in the 17th century in the first quote that you see on the screen, and I share with you. If we procure a very good breed of large and fair mares and stallions that no mongrel breed might come amongst them, we might have a very choice breed for coach horses, saddle and draft. So these really clear categories. And in a few years might draw of considerable numbers and ship them for Barbados, Nevis, or such parts of the Indies. Hull's plan worked, and writing a few years later in 1660, Samuel Maverick observed in the second quote on the screen, "As for the southern part of New England, it's incredible what has been done there. In the year 1626 or thereabouts, there was not a horse, and now it is wonder to see the great number of horses, many sent to Barbados and the other Caribbean islands." So really from the mid-17th century onwards, New England has got an eye for exporting horses to the Caribbean and down to other parts of South America too. Keeping track of horses then was made easier by branding. And one of the most interesting items I found in the CHS collections is what you see on the screen. And this is a 17th century branding record that was kept by Thomas Minor in Stonington that starts from 1660 onwards. And you can see that the horses would have been branded with different letters on their like rear end or on their shoulder for the town they were held in. So you can see this here. So that was a really interesting 17th century item that I found. So part of the wider scope of this project is addressing how New England's horse trade was also entwined with slavery and the trade in enslaved peoples. As you can see on the screen then, enslaved peoples trained specifically in animal husbandry raised horses and other livestock here in New England. The horses then were often directly traded for rum, sugar, molasses, and also enslaved peoples themselves. And upon arrival in the sugar colonies, the horses toiled alongside enslaved peoples crushing sugar in the mill. And you can see that quite clearly on this image from 1724. As you can see on this image then, horses were also used by enslavers to capture freedom seekers. And this is an image from Richard Legion's mid-17th century map of Barbados. Horses also played a role then in reinforcing plantation hierarchies. And you can see this early 19th century image of enslaved peoples not being allowed to ride horses and were forced to kind of run alongside as attendants to their enslavers. And again, I can talk more about this piece of my research in the Q&A if anyone's particularly interested. So key to the talk that I want to give today is talking about how New England's equine breeding and shipping business was directly linked to the rapid rise of the sugar industry from the latter part of the 17th century and throughout the duration of the 18th century. New Englanders sent fish, foodstuff, building supplies such as timber, boards, staves, cattle, horses, and also mules. In return, they obtained sugar, molasses, dye, rum stuff, Spanish dollars, bills of exchange for London. And so it was a really complex economy that horses were a part of. By 1680, Rhode Island's Governor Stamford acknowledged that horses and provisions were the colony's principal export commodities, primarily to the British sugar colonies. And by 1700, the demand for horses had greatly increased in both the Dutch and French colonies as they entered into the market. In the next 20 years then, the shipping increased from New England sixfold, and horses were sent all around the West Indies and Leeward Islands. Again, in Rhode Island in 1731, Governor Jenks placed them first in the list of important goods exported for the colony. And 10 years later, the number of vessels involved in the trade stood at 102. As the 18th century progressed, Connecticut then went on to eclipse Rhode Island as it emerged as the leading exportation center of horses. By 1784, hundreds of vessels carrying horses were launched from shipyards around Connecticut, most notably in New London, New Haven, Norwich, Middletown, and other places too. In a two-day period in 1787, 10 vessels with 302 horses departed from New Haven. In the same year, Middletown shipped over 2,000 head that year. And New London, which seems to be the leading horse export port, exported almost 7,000 horses. One contemporary evaluation of the shipments from New London from 1797 concluded, and I quote here, that shipments of livestock from this port form by no means an inconsiderable article in the export of the United States. So after the revolution, then it's clear that horse exportation does continue to dominate Connecticut's economy. Other reports estimated that 385 horses and 245 mules were shipped annually just from Deshomes from Deshomes Wharf alone. So these shipping records have been a really interesting source for me to peruse. And one Secretary of Customs report in London shows in a single year prior to the Revolution, New England colonies shipped 7,310 horses just to the British West Indies alone. And these records are really interesting to look at because the numbers are just a little bit all over the place. And sometimes kind of contradictory. So what you can see on the screen then is on the left-hand side is a larger view of the whole table recording what every colony and in some cases specific towns sent to different British sugar colonies. And then zoomed in on the right, you can see the number of cattle, horses, hogs, and sheep and poultry that were shipped. So these kind of numeric sources have been quite a useful source for me. So what's increasingly clear the more I research is New Englanders seem to actually struggle to keep up with the demand for horses in the sugar colonies. Even in the 17th century, English parliamentary leaders regularly heard complaints from Barbadian sugar planters and merchants stating that their properties, and I quote, stood in great need of drawing horses and oxen for the mills, without which a great quantity of sugar is likely to perish and be lost for want of grinding. So it seems like there was this never-ending struggle to secure an adequate supply of horses and livestock. And some of this led to planters investigating other ways to turn the mills, and windmills were one of those. As the French and Dutch built up their sugar colonies, New Englanders sought to meet their need for horses too, and this business bloomed as the 18th century progressed. So James Brown and his son Nicholas Brown of Providence in Rhode Island were key players in the shipment of horses to the Dutch colony of Suriname. As you can see on the screen, Nicholas Brown advertised extensively in the Providence Gazette. As draft horses, the Browns saw no value in keeping their equine property in Rhode Island. So these weren't saddle horses, they were draft horses. In November 1768, Nicholas offered Frank and Evan Malbone 30 Suriname horses, as he had, and I quote, no particular use for them at present, as his brig had just sailed. In 1739, James Brown wrote to his agent Sal Cutter, and I quote, I beg you would get me 10 or a dozen Suriname horses. I hope that you will not fail me, for I shall depend on you. The Browns had specific expectations, and I was looking up to spend some time at the John Carter Brown Library in Providence, reading their letters, and they really do give a lot of detail. In 1737, James requested, and I quote, I want some horses that are in case fit for the shipping, that are worth 7 and 14 pounds. Mares will do if they're in good case. They must be between 3 and 8 years of age. And the letters repeatedly stressed that the horses had to be under 14 hands, so essentially a pony. Small enough, then I presume, to turn the sugar mills. And in the letters, there are endless requests for horses that are in good case, that are fat, that are free from lameness, and have 2 good eyes and have good teeth. And in a 2-year period from 1764 to 1766, Nicholas Brown and his company sourced out 255 horses to ship to Suriname alone. The Browns purchased the horses with a mix of goods and money, and in 1765, Nicholas paid $12 apiece for good Suriname horses. And the following year, he paid 48 gallons of New England rum for each horse. As you see on the screen then, in March 1768, Nicholas signed a purchase agreement with Isaac Tripp for 40 horses. So you see the first arrow identifies that he wants 40 horses that, are ready for shipping for the specific Suriname market. Nicholas then paid for the horses, and this is where the second arrow is pointing, in rum, sugar, molasses, and one Negro girl. And so again, thinking about that other element of my research that connects the lives of enslaved peoples to those of draft animals, it's really clear to see that in this source. So during the winter of 1765 to 66, Nicholas Brown kept horses in South Kingston, and he wrote to their keeper, Roland Robinson, I quote, "We expect them well kept so that they will get fat by spring when they ship." However, sadly, that was not to be. On the 20th of December, Robinson informed Nicholas that some of his horses had died. And sadly, as is the way with primary sources, part of the letter that says exactly how many is torn and is missing. And Robinson estimated that the horses were really old, perhaps up to 35 years old, which is a really old age for horses. And they were certainly the oldest horses he'd ever seen. He promised, and I quote, "to take all the pains I can to keep them alive, but it's my opinion they will all die unless they are housed and have grain, which will make the cost too high." Robinson concluded that even if the horses did survive, he would not give Nicholas, quote, $1 a head. "I shall expect to be paid," he said, "for each horse until he dies." Nicholas frantically wrote back the very next day, requesting Robinson, "do your utmost in every respect to preserve their lives, so I can ship what remains to Suriname." Nicholas acknowledged that he'd been most shockingly deceived, as their grinders, their teeth were worn out when he inspected them more closely. And I've been really lucky to spend some time at the International Museum of the Horse in Lexington, Kentucky, studying early modern horsemanship manuals. And these manuals, such as the 1700 version of the Gentleman's Complete Jockey, which you see on the screen, are full of rogue horse dealers and the ways that they dupe potential customers and all the ailments horses faced, and how people in the 18th century treated horses. So again, I can certainly talk more about this in the Q&A if anyone's interested. So I want to talk a little bit now then about how do you get horses across the Atlantic, and what were some of the problems that you faced? So as we heard in the opening story, where all those horses were swept out to sea and drowned, crossing the Atlantic with any cargo was certainly a challenge, and I think it was especially difficult with a live cargo of animals. So what made it more challenging, I guess, is that the equines crossed the Atlantic on the deck, on top of the deck, within kind of temporarily constructed stables. Again, I got really lucky with finding a really detailed description of these temporary awnings, and they were normally around 80 feet high, on top of which food and water was stored. And so that meant basically any time they hit bad weather, the first thing that would either be thrown overboard or would fall would be the food and water for the horses. And the animals were packed tightly and tied in parallel rows with their heads towards each other, standing for the duration of the voyage. Contemporary observers describe how this, and I quote, "was tedious to the poor brutes, and they suffered a great deal." Equines, like humans, needed to get their sea legs, and unsurprisingly, many animals got sick. So shipping logbooks have been a really rich source for my research. And as you can see on the screen, Captain Samuel Capron's voyage on the sloop Prudence from Stonington, Connecticut to Suriname with a cargo of staves, hoops, sheep, and horses in the summer of 1743 highlights in rich or gruesome detail, I guess, how illness could also wipe out stock. When all of the horses were struck down with a sickness that rendered them unable to stand upright on the ship, the crew tried all means to get them to stand, including hauling them from under the awning, isolating, and even stringing them up on awning beams to kind of force them to stand up. these tactics didn't really work. And generally speaking, when horses died on board ships, it was common practice from the kind of wide range of ship logbooks that I've looked at to kind of throw the dead horses overboard. And on the Prudence then, again, traveling from Stonington, the crew dissected a number of the dead horses and found them rotten inside. Again, common practice in the 18th century when horses died was to basically I'm sorry if anyone's eating their lunch anyway, was to dissect them, and they would sometimes save the horse's skin, but they would always save at least one hoof and then throw the rest of the body overboard. And in order to protect their interests, merchants insured their equine cargo, and the reason why they saved the hoof was basically to prove that they had lost a horse on the voyage, so they couldn't fraudulently claim that horses had died when they hadn't. And on the particular voyage of Samuel Capron's ship from Stonington, the sheep got really sick too, and Capron lost 7 sheep to infection, which produced, and I quote, "such a smell and stink that nobody would go near them." And when they finally made it to Suriname, 4 of the surviving horses were in a particularly poor condition, and the crew spent the next few days attending to the horses on shore and basically trying to keep them upright on their feet. Only one of the 4 that made it actually eventually survived, and the crew had to drag 3 dead horses, and I quote, out to the savannah to bury them. So again, from this source, and then from another source I found when I was in London, I was able to piece together why were they dragging them out to the savannah. And what it was is that the Dutch imposed 100 guilder fine for each horse carcass that was found above ground, as so many dead horses were abandoned when ships came in from New England and washed up in the river. So in addition to animal sickness and bad weather, pirates and privateers also interrupted the horse trade, and newspapers reports have been a really useful source for me too, and they report entire shipments of horses that were wiped out when ferocious weather struck. So horses then were not the only animals to cross the Atlantic. Oxen, mules and donkeys, which you can see on the screen, were also exported too. Each animal had their pros and cons, which planters extensively debated. Oxen were slow but expensive, and they didn't tend to stand the climate very well, but they were really powerful. Mules were expensive and hard to come by, but they were stronger than horses. Horses then were typically used to crush the cane in what were described as horse mills, which you see on the screen here. The horses were harnessed to long poles that produced the power to turn a shaft that rotated upright ironclad rollers in the center of the platform. Horses then, compared to mules and oxen, tended to be cheaper and more easily available, particularly from New England, but they were weaker and they often died in such numbers that some plantations got through several teams a year. As early as the mid-17th century, when Henry Whistler visited Barbados in 1655, he noted, and I quote, that the sugar mills, quote, destroy so many horses that it begores the planters. And again, fast forwarding into the 18th century, it's estimated that an average estate in Suriname lost up to 50 to 60 horses per year. And we know that planters almost always overwork the animals. They were also vulnerable to diseases, and wild animals attacked them. And so they were in kind of constant need of horses to be imported. And that was New England's job. So I want to talk a little bit about mules now. So after the Revolutionary War, New Englanders, it seems, started to diversify their equine breeding to include more mules. And this particularly took off in the late 1780s. So in order to export mules, New Englanders needed to acquire jacks. So jacks are sometimes called jackasses. They are male donkeys, and they needed the male donkeys to put to their mares, and that's how you would get a mule. And as you can see, this is a newspaper advert from Rhode Island from a slightly early period in the 17th century. New Englanders got these jackasses from a whole wide range of places, and one of the pieces of my mule research is figuring out like why does it take New Englanders so long to get this mule breeding up and running? How and where are they getting jacks from? And why is it so hard to breed mules? And I can certainly talk a lot more about mule breeding in the Q&A. But what's clear then is New Englanders, in order to acquire jacks to put to their mares, tapped into a range of supply sources, including Iberia and North Africa, as the 18th century progressed. So New Englanders were kind of starting to really, I feel like the pivotal year for New Englanders breeding mules is 1787. And by that year, St. Eustatian planters wanted breeders on the east coast of North America to breed more mules specifically for exportation, and I quote, and to stop shipping parcels of old horses. And there's this open letter that appears from planters in St. Eustatia to breeders along the East Coast. And it was published in all of the newspapers, really as far north as Canada and as far south as Virginia. And it wrote at length to New Englanders, basically saying the horses that they were sending were not, and I quote, not worth the trouble nor expense of exportation, as they were not fit for the mills. And the planters in St. Eustatius were willing to pay good money for the equine laborers they actually wanted, offering 8 or 10 J's for a good mule, whilst horses were valued at half of that amount. So again, I can talk more in the Q&A about this shift. According to the letter then, imported horses did have a place on the island as riding horses, but not as draft animals, nor in the quantities that East Coast merchants were sending them. So we also know then that New Englanders also used Cape Verde jacks to breed mules. And according to a former Connecticut resident in 1787, the Cape Verdean jacks ran wild on the mountains and were rounded up, and I quote specifically, by the Negroes who hemmed them between their ledges of rocks and mountains, then slit their noses, each one with his mark, tie them together with bark, and drive them to their employer to be sold by the score. However, not everyone was impressed by the Cape Verdean jacks that were imported into New England. One former Connecticut resident described how Cape Verdean jacks were, quote, a miserable race of animals for sires and led to a very contemptible breed of mules, which would glut the foreign markets. Others were concerned about the quality of brood mares that some breeders in Connecticut put their mares to. And so there's this real interesting mix on the breeding for export and about how much the jacks are worth, how much the mares are worth. But what's really clear is then once they were exported to the West Indies, the mules still fetched really high prices of 20 to 30 guineas. So in 1787, Mark Prindle from Harwington, Connecticut, imported from Africa with much trouble and expense, and I'm quoting here, a neat and elegant jack named Jack for deal. Prindle offered the following rates to breed mules with his jack. So Prindle offered the following rates: $1 for the single leap, $2 for the season, or free if at the time of covering the customer will engage the mule colt at 4 months old to the subscriber, who will give the generous sum of £4. So like many other breeders around New England, Prindle was fully convinced of the advantage arising from the business of raising mules rather than horses. And other Connecticut residents jumped on this bandwagon, and Frederick Bull is one of them. And Frederick Bull then writes, slightly over the top, that he believed he had the very best jack in the whole of New England. In 1787, Bull offered actually 7 jacks for sale in Hartford, Connecticut, and he wrote that they were of the largest and best breed that had been imported. Bull offered his jacks for sale between June and August, which was the end of the breeding season. Thus, he reassured potential buyers that even if they did not use the jacks this season, they would easily prove their worth the following season. Bull's jacks then were, and I quote, of the true Malta breed, and he was willing to offer a very low rate considering the value of those animals in this country in exchange for shipping horses. So many breeders around New England use the same technique of diversifying their equine breeding by offering stallions and jacks at the same time, but with very different breeding terms to reflect the different markets. So James Eldridge's practices reflect this trend. So Eldridge advertised the services, and I quote, of a famous imported jack, perhaps the largest in the state, in Pomfret, Connecticut in 1786. Like many other breeders, Eldridge brought the mules back at 4 months old and varied his payments based on size, offering between $12 and $15, whilst not charging for mares who failed to get in foal. Eldridge then, like other breeders, particularly in Connecticut, kept an interest in horse breeding alongside his mule raising efforts, offering a stallion Royal American alongside the jack. Others including Nathan Ayres in Preston, Connecticut, Samuel Whitman in Hartford, Connecticut, use this exact same breeding and buying program and offering a stallion and jack together and then buying the mules back when they were 4 months old to keep them and then exporting them at two years old. So it seemed like a very standard practice. Others, including Abel Clark, and you see this on the screen, also bred horses and mules. Clark, who was based in Windham, Connecticut, offered the services of Narragansett, thoroughbred, and also shipping stallions, in addition to jacks into the 1790s. Alongside his stallions, Clark boasted that one of his jacks was so well known, it was almost needless to say anything in his favor. However, as the jack had only been in Windham for 1 season, Clark decided that it was best to post in the Windham Herald to ensure that everybody knew that the jack was, and I quote, without exception, the likeliest, most vigorous and surest jack that is kept in the state of Connecticut. The jack was 11 hands high and 2 inches, 11 hands and 2 inches high, and in proportion. Clark was so certain that his mules were the largest and likeliest in the state that he invited doubters to come and visit the mules to see that he had, quote, not in the least exaggerated their size. So one of the key players in the breeding of mules in Connecticut was Samuel Whitman, whose papers are at CHS. And truthfully, this is one of the most useful collections, I think, for the project that I found to date. I was just going through this last week, and there was a whole folder, which you can see literally 3 images from, dedicated specifically to mule breeding. And so I know that this is going to go on to be one of a really pivotal primary source as I write the book project. And yeah, I was really excited when I found this. I think I may have actually stood up and said yes when I found this. So I'm really happy to share this with you today. So I want to kind of, the last part of my talk, the next 10-15 minutes or so, is going to think about how horses and mules were connected to empires and imperialism as the 18th century progressed. So providing human and non-human animal labor to power sugar plantations was at the heart of rival empire building in the 18th century. As Antiguan planter Samuel Martin observed, and I quote specifically, "Negroes, cattle, mules, and horses are the nerves of the sugar plantation." Thus, New England's effort to breed mules must be understood against this wider backdrop of Atlantic commerce. The soil in many of the islands in the West Indies was not well suited to raising animals, and if planters had spare acreage, they planted sugar or other cash crops. Raising equines required time too. Horses were not ready to work until they were around 3 or 4, whilst mules were ready a little bit earlier, normally around the age of 2. So most planters did not want to waste valuable acreage and time raising equines when they could import mature, work-ready animals directly from New England. And that's not necessarily the case for all of the sugar colonies, but even in Jamaica, where there was a thriving pen economy that bred both equine and bovine workers, breeding efforts were never enough to keep up with demand. So tracking the destination of New England vessels carrying equine cargo is complicated by the fact that the ships often flitted between different islands trying to get the best prices for their wares. So in one voyage, merchants regularly traded with English, French, and Dutch West Indian islands. And so, for example, in 1768, the Grace departed New Haven, Connecticut, bound for Martinique. After selling its wares, the vessel then went to Georgia, where it picked up rice and mules, and then it gets hit by a storm. And after being hit by the storm, the Grace took refuge in St. Eustatia before then heading to the French West Indies to deliver rice and mules. So this really does complicate the picture. And really, from the 1720s and into the 1730s, Britain became increasingly angry that New Englanders were sending their horses to the French and Dutch colonies and not giving preference to the British colonies. In 1730, the House of Commons received Sir John Rushout's report that condemned the French colonies for selling their molasses at a cheaper rate to New Englanders and outpricing the British colonies. To add insult to injury, previously the French had simply fed their molasses to horses and hogs. The report concluded, and I quote, "The French are greatly enriched and the British sugar colonies impoverished." Opinion was divided on what would happen if New Englanders stopped sending horses. Some suggested that Canada could easily send horses, whilst others felt it was impossible. The anonymously published The British Empire in America, considered from a gentleman of Barbados, explored, I'm going to go back to that in a second, explored this issue at length. The pamphlet stated that without horses from New England, the French and Dutch colonies would suffer, as the Dutch had no spare horses. While Spain had mules on the continent, it was, and I quote, "hardly more than sufficient for their own service, and they set a very great value on them, much more than they do to their horses." Even Barbadian planters sought out mules and preferred them to horses. And the author knew of only 6 mules on the island during the last 30 years, when he estimated there were at least 6,000 horses at any time. And the author made really clear, and this really resonated with me, he said, and I quote, that this strength of horses was the principal reason why the French just not attacked Barbados during the course of the last war. So the shipment of horses to the Dutch colony of Suriname was a particularly big business for New Englanders and a particularly sore bone of contention for the mother country and other British sugar colonies. Planters in Suriname were so desperate for horses that the Dutch passed a law that did not, and I quote, "permit a foreigner to trade with them at Suriname unless he import there a certain number of horses in proportion to the burthen of his vessel." So every vessel had to basically bring in horses to be able to trade in Suriname. So this issue of Suriname horses is something that really has piqued my interest, and it's really an ongoing research question for me. So other pamphlets, such as the one you see on the screen, The Present State of the Sugar Plantations Considered, but especially that of the island of Barbados from 1714, explored this issue at length. So Barbadians felt that it was, and I quote that you see on the screen, "indispensably necessary for the government to cherish and support this valuable trade and to discourage all attempt to wrest it out of our hands. In order to do this, some inspections may be necessary into the trade from New England and the northern colonies to St. Thomas, to Croatia, to Suriname, sorry, to Suriname, to the last they send horses, by which they carry on their sugar making, which promotes that Dutch colony in that manufacture. There's a law or order in Suriname that these northern vessels shall not be admitted to trade with them unless they bring such a number of horses." So this Suriname law is really interesting. A particularly notable source that I was able to look at last month when I was over in England working at the National Archives at Kew in London was the source you see on the screen. And I found this then, which clarified the trade to Suriname, which described how New Englanders exported to Suriname, and this is where the arrow points to, exported to Suriname, quote, "small wild horses not fit for service here, nor saleable in our English plantation, for which is brought back chiefly, back in return, chiefly molasses." So basically it was saying that New Englanders are breeding these other horses that the British sugar colonies won't take. And so they're just breeding this generic draft animal to export to Suriname in really high numbers. And another really useful source on this is from Connecticut Historical Society, which explores the kind of intercolonial and interstate rivalry between Rhode Island and Connecticut for horse breeding and mule breeding, but also this piece of the puzzle of the rivalry between the British, French, and Dutch sugar colonies. So the Trumbull papers, I know, are going to be very useful to this research project. As the 18th century progressed, this rivalry intensified, and King George II passed the Molasses Act on the 25th of December, 1733, which put prohibitive duties on molasses, rum, and sugar imported from non-British colonies into the American colonies. The 1733 Act was only laxly enforced, and negligible customs bureaucracy allowed colonial commerce to follow previous route without really any coercion. And we know that, like, as the 18th century progressed, New Englanders even carried on smuggling horses to the French during the 7 Years' War, most notably through the neutral Dutch and Spanish ports. And it wasn't until really after the 7 Years' War came to an end in 1763 that New England's horse trade started to be more extensively regulated as a way of dealing with Britain's excessive debt. King George and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Grenville, decided that taxing sugar would raise money. As fate would have it, the laxly enforced Molasses Act of 1733 was just about to expire. New Englanders vehemently opposed this, and they met in January of 1764 in South Kingston in Rhode Island to discuss the state of affairs. New Englanders tried to play down the importance of their trade in horses to the French and also Dutch, and specifically of the French trade. They said, quote, that the horses we send them serve rather for luxury rather than any real use in the plantation service, and that they may be and are supplied with mules and horses from the Spanish Main. This is very different, though, to what the British Parliament thought, and they concluded that the renewal of the said law would be highly injurious to the interests of both Great Britain and these northern New England colonies. New England's pleas fell on deaf ears, and Britain passed the Sugar Act in 1764. When the British forces occupied Newport during the Revolution, the Sugar Islands were forced to raise their own horses and turn to water power in some other cases. And after the Revolution, it's really clear that Connecticut emerged as the leading exportation center for horses, really eclipsing Rhode Island. So to conclude then, what's the point I'm trying to get to this lunchtime? Well, horses were central to ensuring sugar plantations worked. And in spite of all the dangers in crossing the Atlantic, it made sense to import horses from New England. Sugar planters did not want to waste valuable acreage and time raising horses and mules when they could import mature work-ready animals from New England. So crossing the Atlantic with an equine cargo was a risky business, but it was a profitable one, which only waned as the 19th century progressed. Thank you, and I'll stop there. That leaves us, perfectly at 45 minutes with some time for questions. Do you want me to go through the chat?
I can certainly read them out to you. There's several questions. Let me just get to our first question from Sierra. She's a two-part question. Have you found other examples of connection between Blacks and horses, such as their treatment or using them as currency in exchange for horses? So that's the first part.
Yeah, I can answer that. Yeah, absolutely. So this has been quite a reasonable part of my research. One of the things I've been looking at is the language used to describe enslaved peoples, and the language used to describe animals, horses and mules in particular, and how that language is basically one and the same, and how enslavers use the same qualities to describe their enslaved peoples and also their non-human animal property. And there's been a lot of work looking at things such as estate inventories and how non-human animals and enslaved peoples are listed next to each other. I've also been doing some work on enslaved peoples being specifically trained in animal husbandry in New England. And it seems like there are actually, a significant group of people who have these specialist skills. The particular sources I've seen are newspaper adverts, but also letters. And in Rhode Island, McSparren's diary describes this. And then, yeah, there's a lot of, there's certainly some cases where enslaved peoples and non-human animal property are traded for one another. Like the example I gave today was the Browns, but there are other examples of that. And then obviously when we follow that story over to the West Indies, we see that really enforced too, right? Like enslaved peoples caring for the animals. There are cases in Suriname where enslaved peoples only get meat in their diet when horses die. There are cases of enslaved peoples deliberately killing horses as a means of slowing production and sabotage. And one of the things I'm interested in is the animals that enslaved peoples are allowed to ride. And so in Rhode Island, they have an annual election day for enslaved peoples, and that's a 1 day a year where enslavers allow their enslaved peoples to ride their horses, and they get to ride their finest Narragansett pacers. But that's really different to what's going on down in the West Indies, where enslaved peoples were rarely allowed to ride horses. I showed that master horse slave. That's the caption of that, where enslaved peoples were forced to be running attendants. And enslaved peoples use horses and mules as a means to escape when they're seeking their freedom. So there's a lot of work that's been done on that, and I'm getting more into the animal studies realm and animal history as a discipline too. And one of the things that's clear from the existing historiography is that the animal turn in history is particularly problematic when we look at former slave societies, right? And there's a lot of literature out on there. There's Marjorie Spiegel's The Dreaded Comparison that's there. There's an existing literature on that, and I'm more than happy to share that with you. And then does that answer the first part of your question, Sierra? Yeah. And then the second bit,
she's asking how long it took to breed a horse to be shipped.
Yeah, so that's such a good question. So yeah, it takes a couple of years. So they tend not to export the horses until they're around 3 to 4, because if you kind of put a horse into draft service before it's 3 or 4, it's not fully grown and it won't last that long. So they tend to not export the horses until they're maybe 3 or 4. And then the mules are ready to work at 2. So the mules, they tend to, the mule breeding is really different to the horse breeding, and I hadn't realized that when I started this. So the horses, they'll just put the mares to the stallion, and then that'll be it. The mare owner and the stallion breeder will go their separate ways, and then those horses then will be sourced directly by merchants 4 years later to be exported. But the mules are contracted out, so the people who own these jacks basically write a contract with the people who are bringing their mares, like basically saying you have to sell these mules back to us when they're a few months old, and we'll give you all this money, we'll take your mare for free. And then they keep the mules for 2 years. And again, I've got some really interesting primary sources describing how they just basically leave the mules wild for 2 years, don't really pay much attention to them, and the mules get really nasty and vicious, and then they round them up and then ship them out when they're 2. So it's different for horses and mules, the time that they keep them in New England before they ship them. Does that answer that bit of the question? Yeah, excellent.
And sort of along those lines, Leah's asking, were older horses shipped out? Were they possibly already used in cider mills, or were they used for something else?
Yeah, I mean, there certainly are shipping old horses, right? Like that's thinking about that letter I shared with the St. Eustachian planters that they write in this open public letter that's published in all these newspapers in 1787, telling New Englanders to stop shipping old parcels of horses, right? Like they're rubbish, they're no good to us. So they definitely do ship out older horses. And the thing is too, like it's different to the different colonies. It seems to me that Suriname will take whatever horses they can. This term Suriname horses has been puzzling me for 5 or 6 years now, and I think it just means like these generic horses that Suriname will take because they're so desperate. So they certainly do ship out older horses, but I guess it depends on the market, and the market, just like the market for sugar, fluctuates. Sometimes you can see from the shipping logbooks that, they'll arrive in their destined port, wherever that is, Barbados, Martinique, Jamaica, and they'll be able to sell their horses straight away. But sometimes, looking at the ship logbooks, they have to kind of cruise around the West Indies trying to get the best deals and the prices. And one of the things you see is there's quite a lot of rivalry between Connecticut and Rhode Island, and the letters that survive are like, 20 ships from Connecticut arrived yesterday, and so we can't sell our horses, so we're going to go here. And so, yeah, they do older horses, and yeah, they go all around there.
Well, Linda has two related questions. She's asking, did Connecticut and Rhode Island provide other colonies with horses? But also, did any other colonies besides Connecticut and Rhode Island breed horses and mules?
The answer is yes, to both of those. So yeah, we see that horses are shipped to the south, especially as the 18th century, like the south of not South America, but the south of the US, if that makes sense, towards the end of the 18th century. So we see that horses are shipped south there. We see that Rhode Island and later Connecticut ship horses to places like Pennsylvania, to some extent to New York, but to the American South they certainly do. And mules too, we see that mules are shipped from Connecticut and Rhode Island to plantations in the South that do use mule labors. And we see more of that actually as George Washington gets in on the mule breeding business as the 18th century progresses. So we see that trade too. And then what was the other bit?
Did other colonies besides Connecticut and Rhode Island breed horses?
Yeah, yes and no. So there's some horse breeding and some mule breeding going on in Massachusetts. You see some of it up in New Hampshire as the 18th century progresses. Some of it in New York, a little bit further south, but not specifically to export to the West Indies. There's a whole bunch of other places, like, as I said in my talk, the Spanish Main provides horses too. There's a bit coming from Canada, but it's really clear that New England, particularly Rhode Island and later Connecticut, does really dominate this trade as the 18th century goes on.
Christine is wondering, were women involved at all in this process?
I wish I could say yes, but the honest answer is not that I've seen so much. It seems to me in New England, it's men who are doing the breeding. We see there's one example of a woman on Aquidneck Island whose husband dies and she takes over some of the breeding. There's a couple of cases of women in Connecticut and also of Rhode Island, again, when their husbands died, they bring their mares to the stallion, or they bring their mares to the jack. In terms of animal husbandry, as a specialist profession, the enslaved peoples that I've seen are men in that business for the most part. But then I think once we get across to the West Indies, certainly enslaved peoples who were female were involved in caring for the animals, but no, not really. And perhaps I could look a little bit harder to try to find that.
Okay, Corey, hi Corey. She's asking, how did the wars of the 18th century impact horse trade, especially to the Caribbean?
Massively is the answer. Yeah. So the wars, so one of the things that's really been interesting to read is like pirates and privateers like seizing these ships and how that had a huge impact on the trade. The wars with the French and the Dutch. I mean, that's what this whole trade is about, right? The fact that even if they're not actually at war with the French and the Dutch at the time, London is really concerned with empire building and how, if we keep sending these horses to the French and the Dutch, they are going to have the biggest and best sugar empire in the world, and our British colonies are going to be ruined. And so whether it's directly tied to war or just broader ideas about colonialism and imperialism, that rivalry is prevalent. And yes, the sources talk at length about how we might just be sending these horses for plantation work now, but if we go to war with the French again, they're going to use those horses against us. So it has a huge impact. And then obviously amidst the American Revolution, it's really clear that from the sources from as early as the 1720s that New England is a really really upset that England is trying to regulate this trade. They clearly want to be able to trade with the French and the Dutch and make the money. And England's really upset that they don't seem to play by the rules and they're just sending these horses over there. So I think as the 18th century progresses, this friction between New England and England about the horse trade is certainly bubbling up in the background as revolution kind of brews as we hit the 1770s.
Interesting. I think, anybody have any other questions? I'm just going to put that out there. I think I covered everything in the chat at this moment. Anybody? This is such a complex topic. It's fascinating, all the directions you could go in, and it sounds like you've got a lot of material to synthesize yet.
That's so true. Yeah, so much work to do.
Well, thank you so much for presenting today and filling us in on what you've found so far. This is really very interesting to just hear how we have so much material, but to see how Connecticut and Rhode Island are playing such a big role in the horse trade. Excuse me. I did want to share my screen for a moment. We do have 2 upcoming events that I wanted to shamelessly plug. One is Wednesday, the 22nd, in 2 days. We have our Woodward lecture, How Black Women Broke Barriers and Won the Vote, by historian Dr. Martha Jones. And that is virtual. And we also have a talk a week from Thursday on the 30th, Dark Treason of Benedict Arnold, by historian Richard Bell. And that is also virtual. So these are both virtual programs that we hope we'll see you at. And you can join us. And all the information on registering is on our website for both of these. But thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, Dr. Carrington-Farmer. This was a really great lecture for us. A lot of great information. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. It's been my pleasure to present. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. You could just look me up online and my email address will be on my Roger Williams page. So thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Bye-bye.
I think the timing worked quite well, Jen. I feel like we got it just about right with the questions and everything.
Absolutely, that was perfect.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Great. Thank you so much. This was really interesting. I loved every minute of it. I'm glad we recorded it so I can go back and rewatch a few parts.
Yeah, and if you now have more suggestions from things for me to look at, like, I would happily take them. So yeah, if anything crosses your mind, that could, then let me know.
Yeah, and I know Sierra was on, and she certainly she manages our research center. I'm sure you met her, and she is a wealth of information. So I'm sure she would have lots of.
She's already said so much.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. She really has a great handle on her collection.
Oh, definitely, 100%. Well, I shall bid you farewell and thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I may see you in Hartford. I'm coming again, I think not this week, the week after. So.
Oh yeah, I'll be in.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, all right, bye.
Thank you, bye-bye.